Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We're diving back into modern Indian history, picking up where we left off, especially for our UPSC folks, those of you tackling the GS1 Modern History section, and of course for anyone, really anyone who finds this era fascinating.
Absolutely.
Last time, if you remember, we were exploring that whole tumultuous birth of India and Pakistan.
Right, right.
Today, we're going to kind of shift gears a bit.
Yeah.
We're looking at a lesser-known event, something that, well, honestly, it could change everything. The Desai-Liaqat Pact.
It really could have.
Imagine this. What if there was a chance early on for India and Pakistan to, genuinely forge a path towards peace?
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
That's where I'm packing today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, hey, if you're finding this deep dive, insightful or helpful or whatever, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like.
Yeah, definitely. It really helps others find the show, too.
So let's set the stage a little bit.
Okay.
This pact, it doesn't just come out of nowhere, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. I mean, think about it. This pact emerges during a time of just immense tension. It's almost like a beacon of hope in the middle of a storm.
Ooh, I like that.
Years of, strained relations, those periodic conflicts, and always the shadow of partition hanging over everything.
It's heavy stuff.
Oh, it is. You can practically feel the weight of history bearing down on these two nations.
And to add to all that, to make it even more intense, both countries eventually developed nuclear weapons.
Exactly. Right? Talk about raising the stakes for peaceful resolutions, right?
No kidding.
But here's the thing. Amidst all this tension, all this pressure, there's this glimmer of something remarkable.
Okay, I'm listening.
Both India and Pakistan, they actually acknowledged, publicly, that dialogue, peaceful coexistence, it was absolutely necessary.
Wow. So they both agreed on that, despite everything.
They did. It's like they both took a breath together and then held it, waiting to see if they could exhale together,
That's a great image.
And that's where the Desai-Liaqat Pact comes in. Center stage.
Right. This agreement, signed right at this crucial moment, it offered this, a potential roadmap to peace, you could say.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Yeah,
You walk us through, the key features of the pact.
Of course. So one of the absolute cornerstones of this whole agreement was this concept of mutual non-aggression.
Mutual non-aggression.
Yeah, imagine it. Both India and Pakistan committing solemnly to not attack each other, to refrain from any act of hostility, any use of force. It's like they were trying to build the dam to hold back this flood of conflict.
So it's not just about saying we won't attack each other.
No, it goes much deeper.
It's about actually addressing the root causes, right?
You got it. And that's where the focus on comprehensive bilateral dialogue came in.
Okay, so explain that. Sure, so it wasn't just about avoiding war, They wanted to talk about everything that was causing tension. We're talking territorial disputes, cross-border terrorism, which was a huge issue even back then, trade barriers, even cultural exchanges. Everything was on the table for discussion.
So they were willing to have those tough conversations.
They were. They understood that true peace, it needed more than just the absence of fighting, right? It needed a willingness to really engage, to get into those uncomfortable topics and, to actually search for some kind of common ground.
That's huge, honestly, considering everything that had happened between them.
It was a big step. And then to kind of strengthen this whole idea of communication, the pact proposed something else that was pretty innovative.
Go on, I'm intrigued.
Confidence-building measures.
Confidence-building measures. What are those?
Think of it as bridging that gap between, what people say and what they actually do.
Okay, I think I see what you mean.
So the pact called for more people-to-people contact cultural exchanges, student programs, even exchanges between military personnel.
So getting to know each other on a human level.
Exactly. The goal was to break down all those stereotypes, all that ingrained suspicion, and just remind everybody that even with political tensions, we're all human.
It's like instead of just top-down diplomacy, it's building understanding from the ground up.
That's a great way to put it.
And how effective do you think that kind of approach could be?
Well, imagine a Pakistani student actually experiencing the culture of India firsthand, or an Indian officer sharing a meal with his Pakistani counterpart.
Yeah, I can see how those personal interactions could be really powerful.
They can be incredibly powerful in, chipping away at all those long-held prejudices. They even talked about sports diplomacy.
Sports diplomacy.
Yeah, like cricket matches, other sporting events as a way to, promote goodwill and healthy competition.
Ah, cricket. The sport that can unite and divide the subcontinent with equal passion.
Right. You said it. And they saw that shared love of the game as a real opportunity.
That's really interesting. So it wasn't just about, like, preventing conflict?
No,
It was about actually building a future where these two nations could thrive together.
exactly. They wanted to create an environment where economic growth, shared prosperity, those were real possibilities.
Makes sense.
They knew that trade, investment, cross-border infrastructure projects, all of that could benefit both sides. And think bigger picture, too. A peaceful South Asia could mean so much more.
Like what?
Greater regional cooperation? Imagine India and Pakistan working together to tackle issues like poverty or climate change. The possibilities were pretty exciting.
It really does sound like they were trying to lay the groundwork for a whole new kind of relationship.
It's almost like they were sketching a blueprint for a brighter future,
Yeah.
one where cooperation replaces conflict. It's a powerful image, isn't it? But as you probably know, history took a bit of a different turn.
Yeah, and that's what makes this pact so fascinating to me. And honestly, a bit heartbreaking too.
I agree.
We've talked about all this amazing potential, this real effort to try and build peace.
Mm-hmm.
But then the big question is, like, why didn't it work? Why didn't it last?
Right. That's the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. Because despite all those promising features we talked about, the Desai-Liaqat Pact, it ran into some serious challenges.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest was just this deep-seated mistrust. Decades of conflict, all that political maneuvering, it had created this foundation of suspicion that was really hard to overcome.
So even if both sides had good intentions, it's not like you can just erase all that history overnight.
Exactly. It's like trying to build a house on shaky ground.
I see what you mean.
And then, to make things even more complicated, domestic politics got in the way. On both sides, there were powerful groups, people who, well, they had a lot to gain from the conflict continuing.
So they didn't want peace.
Not necessarily, but they saw this pact, this change, as a threat.
To their power.
Right. And they actively worked to undermine it, to sabotage it from within.
Wow, so even when you have leaders who are trying to choose peace, there are these other forces trying to pull them back into conflict.
It happens all the time, unfortunately, and it's a reminder of just how hard it is to build lasting peace.
So what happened? I mean, specifically, what went wrong with the pact?
Well, I can't get into all the details,
Sure.
but there were certain incidents, certain actions, I won't name names, but they ultimately derailed the pact.
So it just fell apart.
In a way, yes. And it's a tough lesson in how fragile peace can be, especially when you have these deep political and social divisions.
Yeah, it's almost like a Greek tragedy or something, this chance for peace, and then it just slipped away because of these internal conflicts and power struggles.
It's definitely tragic, but even though it failed, I think the Desai-Liaqat Pact still gives us a lot to think about, especially for those of you who are preparing for the UPSC exam.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that. How does this whole episode, how does it relate to what's going on between India and Pakistan today?
It's like looking in a mirror, A lot of the issues that cause problems for the pact, the mistrust, the territorial disputes, the security concerns, they're still there.
So in a way, history is repeating itself.
In some ways, yes. But the good thing is, if we understand the past, it can help us make sense of the present, right?
Right.
We can see how those historical patterns are still influencing things today. But it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay, yeah.
The Desai-Liaqat Pact, it also reminds us that dialogue, even when it's difficult, even when it fails, it's still the best way forward. It's the only way to find a lasting solution.
It shows that giving up on diplomacy, that's not an option.
Exactly. And for anyone studying for the UPSC, this whole episode is like a goldmine of information. It shows you the complexity of India-Pakistan relations, the challenges of peace building, the role of diplomacy.
Like a real-world case study, right?
That's a great way to put it. And it reminds us that history, it's not just dates and names. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world.
And the choices we make. So whether you're, a history buff, a UPSC aspirant, or just someone who wants to understand the world better, the Desai-Liaqat Pact, it's a window into a really crucial moment in history.
A moment that's still shaping things today.
Okay, so we've reached the end of this deep dive.
We have.
But before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
I do, actually. I'd like to leave you with something to think about.
Ooh, I love a good cliffhanger.
So we know the pact failed, right? But what if, instead of starting with those big political issues, what if they had focused on economic cooperation first?
Interesting.
Do you think that could have been a better approach? Could shared economic interests have helped build enough trust to tackle the tougher issues later on? Think about it.
It's a really interesting question, yeah. Flipping the script a little, right?
Exactly. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. I mean, peace, it's not just about, stopping the fighting. Yep. It's about building connections, creating those shared interests, like a future where both sides actually benefit from working together.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
Imagine, like, if India and Pakistan were, really economically connected, wouldn't that make conflict, like, way more costly?
Yeah, I guess so. Like, they'd have too much to lose.
Exactly. And it's not just some, theoretical idea. Think about the European Union. Centuries of fighting, right?
Yeah.
And economic integration, it was a huge part of creating peace there. It's not a perfect solution, obviously, but it's a different way of looking at these problems.
It's like you're building this web of connections
Huh?
where those economic ties make it harder to, like, fall back into old habits.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. So even though the Desai-Liaqat Pact failed, it's not just some, irrelevant piece of history.
What can we learn from it?
It reminds us that there are different ways to approach peace, different things to try. And for those of you studying for the UPSC exams, well, this is a perfect example of how history can actually inform policy decisions today.
So it's not just about the past.
No. When you're analyzing current events, don't just, look at the headlines. Dig deeper. Look for those historical connections. See how these different approaches to conflict resolution, how they've played out before. It's like you have this secret decoder ring, to help understand the present.
I like that analogy. So
Yeah.
we can learn from the past, even the failures.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. The pursuit of peace. It's tough, it's messy, it can be frustrating,
For sure.
but it's worth it. Don't let the failures of the past discourage you. Use them to find new solutions, innovative solutions, maybe even some unconventional ones.
It's like a call to action.
It is, whether you're, an aspiring diplomat or a policymaker or just a concerned citizen, we all have a role to play in making the world a more peaceful place.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Desai-Liaqat Pact.
It has been a pleasure.
A huge thank you to our expert for all these amazing insights.
My pleasure, really.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring.
And keep that hope for a more peaceful world alive.